All right. So today we're going to hear presentations from Amanda Hale with Texas Christian University, Chuck Lesh with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Tanner Gue, hopefully I got that right, Tanner, with Ducks Unlimited. Amanda will be presenting on, I guess it's two different projects. Wind turbines do not negatively affect nest success in the Dickcissel, and an analysis of displacement from wind turbines in a wintering grassland bird community. And Amanda is an associate professor of biology at Texas Christian, and she has a PhD in biology from the University of Miami. Her areas of expertise include ecology and evolution, genetics, and conservation biology. And among her many impressive credentials, Amanda is also an adjunct science advisor to AWWI. Chuck Lesh will be presenting on the effects of wind energy development on breeding duck densities in the Prairie Pothole region. And Chuck is a wildlife biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he has worked there for 21 years. And since 1995, he's been stationed in Bismarck, North Dakota with the Region 6 Habitat and Population Evaluation Team Office. And his work focuses on breeding waterfowl and wetlands and grassland-related conservation issues. And then finally, we'll hear from Tanner on the effects of a large-scale wind farm on breeding season survival of female mallards and blue-winged teal in the Prairie Pothole region. Tanner has a master's degree from the University of North Dakota, where he studied breeding waterfowl ecology in the northern Great Plains. And the research that he is presenting on today was generated from his master's work. And Tanner is currently working as a conservation specialist with Ducks Unlimited in the Great Plains Regional Office in Bismarck, North Dakota. So before I turn it over to Amanda for her presentation, a couple of logistics items. Sound, everyone should be able to hear us through your computers. So hopefully that's all working for everyone. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, you can reach out to our associate, Ian Evans. He's sitting at his desk, and he can help you try to figure out what your issue is. You can reach him at 202-448-8779, or his email is also in the webinar room there. If you're having logistics problems or questions or having trouble hearing, there is a pod in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen that's titled Q&A, and you can send me a message through that, and I can respond to you that way. And that's also how we will handle questions and answers for the webinar. Because everyone's listening on the computer, we'll take questions in writing. So you can type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of that pod there and send your question along, and I'll be keeping track of those and read them out loud for everyone to hear. And you can feel free to type in your question whenever it comes up. You don't need to wait till the end of the presentation. And finally, we are recording this webinar. We'll be posting it on the website as well as PDFs of all the presentations so that folks who weren't able to get on, or if you have to leave early and whatnot, you can go back and reference the work. So why don't we go ahead and get started. And Amanda, I will pull up your presentation and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Lauren.
Take a second to come up here. All right, you seeing it?
I'm seeing it, so we're good to go, you think?
Great, good to go.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks, Lauren, and thank you, everyone, for being willing to spend some time this afternoon to hear about our research. It really is a pleasure to share a couple of new papers that have come out of my lab. So let's see if I can advance this. Okay, so I guess, first of all, despite the recognized environmental benefits of wind energy, there are concerns about the potential impacts to wildlife, particularly birds and bats. Those impacts can be broadly categorized as either direct or indirect, and for the purpose of today, I'm really only going to be talking about the indirect effects of wind energy development on grassland birds. So we know that these indirect effects, or the idea is that these effects could contribute to habitat loss and fragmentation. So the installation and operation of wind farms perhaps could disrupt migratory pathways. It could displace wildlife from otherwise suitable habitat, and it could even alter nesting success of some groups. We know that not all birds are likely to be impacted in the same way by wind energy development, but grassland birds as a group really are of concern, and this is for a couple of reasons. The first of these is that the grassland birds have experienced the greatest levels of population decline of all groups of birds in North America over the last 4 decades or so. So in this graph from the 2009 State of Birds report, what you can see is the grassland birds are shown in that dark blue line, and they've shown the greatest annual decline, perhaps with an uptick here in recent years, but still they are certainly threatened. A big cause of this is loss of habitat, so it's thought that only 10% of their breeding and wintering habitat in the United States remains, but pesticides and other land use changes are certainly contributing to this. If we look at where grassland birds are in the United States, what's shown here in green is the historic extent of the shortgrass, mixed grass, and tall grass prairies, and then the area encircled in black here that should be coming along represents an area with the greatest densities of grassland birds in the United States. So this area is an important resource for grassland birds, but it's also an important resource for wind energy development. And so if we superimpose instead on this graph the 2012 year-end capacity, so installed wind energy development in the United States, you can see that region in the middle represents not only an area that's already experienced tremendous grow out in wind energy, but also the potential for much more development in future years. So we really need to try to understand and get a handle on what are the indirect effects of wind turbines and grassland birds, and if there are negative effects, then what can we do to mitigate or minimize those impacts. So my group has been investigating these questions at a wind facility in north central Texas. It's called Wolfridge Wind, and it's owned and operated by NextEra Energy Resources. This wind farm is comprised of 75 1.5 megawatt GE wind turbines, and they're generally arrayed in an east to west fashion. And the northern part of the wind farm is a shrub forested woodland that leads down an escarpment to the Red River boundary between Texas and Oklahoma to the north. And then the southern extent of the wind resource area is a matrix of cattle pastures, hay fields, and some agricultural fields, primarily winter wheat. So this wind farm was under construction in 2008. It went online in October of that year, and then my group has been investigating both the direct and indirect effects on birds and bats here since about the winter of 2009. So as far as indirect effects goes, once we started working at this site, we really tried to focus our research in answering 3 questions. The first was, can we see any evidence of negative effects of wind turbines on nest success in grassland birds? The second question was to determine if breeding birds are displaced from wind turbines, if we see a difference in density of breeding birds or density of nests themselves. And then the third question that we wanted to answer was, are wintering birds displaced from wind turbines? And I think the first 2 questions, the results from these studies should be generally applicable to wind energy development within the Great Plains. And then the third question, these wintering birds, I think this is really going to be restricted to the southern extent of the Great Plains, where you've got important overwintering habitat for many of the grassland birds. So they're going to, not all of these migrants are going to go all the way across the Gulf of Mexico and down to Central and South America to overwinter, but they're actually just going to come down to Texas. So the 2 papers that I'm going to do my best to summarize today really represent collaborative work, and I want to make sure I acknowledge both Aaron Hatchett and Tom Stevens. So Aaron Hatchett is the primary author on the first paper about Dickcissel nesting success, and this is just one of 2 papers from her master's research, and she just did a tremendous job in the field, and the data that I'm going to share was really gathered by Aaron through her hard efforts. And then the second paper represents the thesis research of Tom Stevens, also a fabulous graduate student who worked in my lab, an amazing bird biologist, and he had the ability to be out in these fields in the wintertime identifying birds when they're in their drab winter plumage and when they're not singing. And so it really, that project in particular, took a special kind of person in order to get these data, and I couldn't have done it without their help. So let's go ahead and start then first with Aaron's paper. So we'll take a look at Dickcissel nesting success and then move into Tom's paper at the end. So I guess the primary objective of Aaron's study was to determine if Dickcissel nest success varied with distance to turbines. So do we see any impact of wind turbines on productivity in this species? So Aaron surveyed nest areas and she delineated 6 different core areas in order to search for nests in the breeding seasons of 2010 and 2011. And these areas were selected based on work that was done by another graduate student, Jeff Meyer, in 2009, who looked at density of breeding birds at the wind farm. So over this 2-year period, she found 193 Dickcissel nests. Overall nest success was about 30%, and this is actually quite good for a grassland bird, and it's in line with nest success studies that have been done with Dickcissels at other sites. So what did she find with respect to Dickcissel nest density? So the top 2 graphs are showing Dickcissel nest density per 10 hectares on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis is the mean distance to nest turbine. And so what you can hopefully see from those yellow dots in 2010 and 11 is that there's no relationship to nest density and distance to turbine in this species, no relationship whatsoever. However, if you look down at the graph in the lower right-hand side, this is showing Dickcissel nest density on the y-axis again, and mean vegetation density and height on the x-axis. And what we see is a strong relationship between Dickcissel nest density and the mean vegetation heights and density. And so what it seems to be happening is that Dickcissels are choosing to place their nests in areas with tall and dense vegetation, and this is regardless of distance to wind turbine. So these data indicate there's no displacement of Dickcissel nests away from wind turbines. Erin also looked at causes of nest failure. So when she was monitoring these nests, she'd find a nest, and then she'd go out and check it every 3 days, and then record evidence of eggs and nestlings, and then look for evidence of either nest success or nest failure. And when a nest failed, she tried to attribute it to one of these causes shown here in this bar graph. So based on sort of the state of the nest, she could categorize nest failure to being either bird and small mammal predators, medium-sized mammals, or snakes. And then a few of the nests were abandoned, so there were intact nestlings and eggs, but no signs of the parents. And then a few of the nests were attributed to an unknown cause of failure. And so what you can see here is that snakes accounted for 69% of the nest failure at our site. So snakes are the biggest predator of Dickcissels. And these nests, the nests were intact when she found them, but all of the eggs or nestlings were missing. So she wanted to explore this further and see, could predation, are there particular nests that maybe have a higher risk of being predated compared to others? And so what Erin did is broke the nests into 3 categories: the nests that were abandoned, the nests that had been depredated, and then nests that were successful. So these are the nests that successfully fledged at least one young Dickcissel. And what she found is that nests that had been depredated were significantly closer to wooded edges than they were to wind turbines. And so she also looked, though, at what's the relationship between wooded edges and wind turbines. And nests that were close to wind turbines were farther away from wooded edges than nests that were farther away. So this is giving a hint that something's going on perhaps with predators and wind turbines in the habitat sort of landscape configuration at Wolfridge that could be impacting nest success in this species. And so what Erin did next then, she created a series, took a logistic exposure approach and created models of nest survival using 170 nests that had a full set of data, and these nests represented over 1,500 nest intervals. And so the idea here is the response variables looking at the probability or the likelihood of a nest surviving from one day to the next. So she built 22 candidate models with 4 different combinations of predictor variables. So based on those preliminary analyses, we thought that nest survey area might be important. So it could be of those 6 areas that we searched for nests. Some might just have higher quality grasslands, fewer predators, that sort of thing. We also thought that nest initiation date might be important. This is commonly seen in many bird reproductive studies. So earlier nests tend to be more successful than nests that are started later in the season. And then we also included distance to nearest turbine and distance to wooded edge in these models. So once we developed these 22 candidate models, ran the logistic exposure models, we then ranked these candidate models using the Akiki information criteria, adjusted for small sample sizes, and then used an Akiki weight to help look at how important is a model or a hypothesis in explaining the variation that we see in nest survival. And then for individual variables, we could also look at the relative importance weight, which gives an idea of if you have multiple variables that are important in explaining the variation in nest success, it can help you rank them in terms of which one might be more important compared to the others that you've included in your models. And so what did we find? Well, of the 22 models that we built, only 2 of them were informative and explained the variation that we saw in survival in Dickcissel nests. So the first model there includes both initiation date and distance to turbine, and the second model includes initiation date. All of the other 20 models either weren't supported by the data or were uninformative. So what is the effect then of initiation date? Well, what we found is that more successful nests were in fact had initiated earlier in the season compared to nests that were unsuccessful. And so this wasn't a surprise, but the relative importance weight of this variable was 1, and that importance weight can range from 0 to 1. So it's the best explanation that we have, or driver determinant of Dickcissel nest success. As far as distance to nearest turbine goes, we also found a significant effect of this variable, and what we found is that successful nests were closer to the nearest wind turbine than were nests that were unsuccessful. So we found a weak positive association with nesting success and wind turbines. And then as we look down through the models, we found no importance of distance to wooded edge or of nest area in explaining the variation in nest fate here. So in summary for this study, we found no evidence of nest displacement in Dickcissels, and we found no negative effect of wind turbines on nest survival. So again, successful nests were initiated earlier in the season, and we found this positive association with wind turbines. And we think that this positive association is most likely mediated through changes in the predator community, and this is something that needs to be explicitly studied. So it could be that wind turbines that are far away from these wooded edges happen to be farther away from habitat that's routinely used by snakes. So it looks like in many of these areas similar to our site, that snakes tend to be using edge habitats, forested corridors to move from place to place, and that if a nest is built out in the open close to a wind turbine, it might just be experiencing a reduction in predation by snakes. Alternatively, what we could see is that all predation is lowered when nests are built near to wind turbines, and this could be perhaps due to disturbance from vehicular traffic out to service the wind turbines or some other disturbance associated with the wind turbines themselves, but that really warrants, I think, further study. And then I think lastly from this study is that we really need to be taking a look at nest success studies at other wind facilities throughout the Great Plains, and then really focus on our efforts on species that are at greatest risk, because it's likely that different species are going to respond differently to wind turbines, and we don't have enough time or money to study them all. So we really need to sort of strategically try to focus our efforts where they're most needed. Okay, so the second study, are wintering birds displaced by wind turbines? This was the primary focus of Tom Stevens' thesis research. And what he did is he went out, well, first he identified using GIS and established 210 1-hectare survey plots. So he used an area-based search methodology to survey overwintering birds in the wind resource area, and he did this over 2 winters, from December through February in 2009 and 10, and then also December through February in 2010 and 11. The yellow dots or squares represent the 1-hectare survey plots in 2009, and the red are the survey plots from 2010 and 11. So these plots were anywhere from 17 to just over 1,400 meters from a nearest wind turbine, and 64% of them were located in pastures, 22% in hay fields, and 14% in agricultural fields. And when Tom would go out to these plots, record the locations of birds, and then he also collected microhabitat data, land use data, and some other vegetation data within these plots. And what Tom basically found is that there are quite a few species overwintering within the wind resource area. He identified 26 species. Overall, 75% of the plots were occupied, and the most abundant wintering birds were Savannah sparrows and meadow larks that made up nearly 2/3 of all of the individual observations, as well as observations of either an individual or a flock, so 2 or more birds that were together at one point in time. Of all of these different species, we had enough data from 4 different species or species groups that allowed us to analyze displacement on an individual species level. So Savannah sparrows were seen in 124 of the 210 plots. Meadowlarks are actually comprised of eastern meadowlarks and western meadowlarks. They're not singing during the winter time, and we aren't able to tell them apart based on any plumage differences. So we've put both species together into this one category. They were relatively abundant as well. We saw them on 57 plots, and then Sprague's pipits and Lecat sparrows were our other 2 species. So in order to analyze displacement, we took a 2-step approach. So the first is, for each species individually, we looked for significant habitat associations. And basically, we looked for a non-random distribution of, or pattern of plot occupancy by each species that could be attributed either to field use, so was it a hay field, a pasture, or agricultural field, and then also based on the most common plant species within those plots. If the answer was no, that we don't see any significant habitat associations, we simply analyzed displacement using binary logistic regression. So our response variable was occupancy of the plot, 0 if no, 1 if yes, and then distance to turbine was our explanatory variable. If, however, we did find significant habitat associations, we then wanted to determine, okay, what are suitable plots for this species based on our microhabitat and other vegetation data, and we identified these suitable plots using a niche modeling approach in Maxent. And then once we identified those suitable plots, we then threw out the unsuitable plots and used binary logistic regression to look for evidence of displacement. And so in these 4 different groups, what we found for meadowlarks and Sprague's pipit was first, no significant habitat associations, and then second of all, we found no pattern of displacement from these wind turbines. In Savannah sparrows, on the other hand, we did find significant habitat associations based on land use and most common grass species, but when we tried to use Maxent to identify suitable habitat for Savannah sparrows, the model wasn't successful at doing this. So of the habitat characteristics that we gathered, we believe we missed something that's important to Savannah sparrows, and we therefore were unable to model their habitat. But if we then follow this up with binary logistic regression, we found no influence on distance to turbine to the pattern of plot occupancy in this species. Now if we come to Lecat sparrow, what we find is once again, we see yes, there's a significant habitat association for this species. They're much more likely to be found in hay fields compared to pastures and in agricultural lands, and they were also associated with many of the native grasses. And then we used Maxent to identify and model suitable habitat for the species, and then when we conducted the binary logistic regression, we found that plots that were far away from wind turbines were significantly more likely to be occupied by the species compared than plots that were close to wind turbines. So let me show you kind of how this Maxent process worked. So here is, once again, a picture of the study site, and all of the plots that were surveyed, and the ones that are in gray were unoccupied by the Lecat sparrow, and the ones that are in black were occupied by this individual. We fed our microhabitat data for those plots that were occupied by the Lecat sparrow into Maxent, and this computer then generated probability of presence for each of the surveyed plot. And so this value ranges from 0 and potentially up to 1, and on our scale it goes up to 0.79. So the plots that are now colored, the cool colors, so the greens and the blues, are unsuitable for this species based on the occupied plots, and those that are warm in color are more suitable for the Lecat sparrow. So we used a couple of different thresholds. So I'll just show you our most stringent habitat suitability. So all of the teal and blue plots have now been removed from the analysis, and we conducted a logistic regression on the remaining 86 plots that Maxent identified as being suitable for this species, and what we found was significant displacement from Lecat sparrow. So they were much more likely to be found in suitable habitat far from wind turbines compared to suitable habitat close to wind turbines. And if we then kind of break our plots into 3 categories, what we found is that the probability of a plot being occupied was significantly higher and exceeded 0.4 for plots that were more than 400 meters away from wind turbines. And so we think that this kind of approach could be used to come up with some mitigation recommendations, perhaps for this species or others, that say that they're really going to be displaced from habitat that's within 400 meters of a wind turbine. So we might need to compensate for that in some way. So one thing we also looked at with this community is, well, we've got 1 of 4 species or species groups that seems to be displaced. What's different about this species? Well, the Lecat sparrows is the only species at our study site in the wintertime that relies on a cryptic evasion strategy. So it tends to be solitary or in very small groups. It skulks and creeps around in the vegetation, and whereas the other species use a social evasion strategy. So this is something that's different, and it could be that displacement may be impacted by the behavior of an organism or what we see in their predator avoidance behavior. And then we also think could also be contributing to this is that species-specific displacement could depend on tolerance to disturbed habitats, and that you're going to see those species that are robust and are not displaced are more likely to persist in landscapes that have been altered by humans in some way. So we really need to be looking at perhaps species that have behavior or habitat tolerance that makes them more likely to be disturbed by wind turbines or other forms of anthropogenic disturbance. So in summary from this study, displacement really appears to be species-specific. So again, we caution against lumping different species together based on similar ecology or behavior, and we really want to focus future research on species that are thought to be at greatest risk, whether it's through their behavior or tolerance to disturbance, and that we shouldn't forget about species that inhabit the southern extent of the Great Plains in the wintertime, and that this represents important habitat for them and needs to sort of be on our radar. With that, I'd like to acknowledge NextAir Energy Resources and the staff at Wolfridge Wind for their help in supporting this study, as well as lots of people from TCU and Environmental Studies in the Department of Biology, and the technicians and TCU students who helped gather the data. So with the remaining time, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that you have.
All right, well, thanks so much, Amanda. We've had a couple questions come in for those who joined late. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box on your webinar screen there. There should be a dialog box at the bottom where you can type your question in and send it over to me, and I will read it out loud. The first question, Amanda, is asking about some studies that have used video that have found that nest contents or nest conditions can't be relied upon to accurately assess what predator is predating a nest, and if you've considered video cameras to verify your results relating to predator ID.
We haven't used them, but that would be something that we would certainly like to try. We initially we also had artificial nests out at the site, but the artificial nests containing eggs that aren't viable and those eggs aren't warm, with the cameras, we didn't get any activity at those artificial nests and abandoned that sort of side project that went with the study.
Okay, thanks. Second is more of a comment than a question, and thought I'd share and see if you had anything to add, noting that the fact that snakes were the major predator in this study may not be applicable to all breeding areas. So if there's anything you would add to that.
No, and I think that's why there's a whole effect of wind turbines being mediated through predation really needs to be studied, I think, in grassland birds. And it even reminds me of Brett Sandercock and his colleagues' study with the prairie chickens, and that we need to get at these mechanisms. And if we're seeing either negative or positive effects of wind turbines, really figuring out how that's actually operating and impacting these populations is really probably the only way we're going to get at an effective way to mitigate or minimize these effects. So so figuring out, getting more information on that predator community would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Great. This one's kind of a side question, but folks might find it interesting, asking if there was any pest management, specifically rodent trapping, that was taking place at the wind turbines and the wind farm in order to prevent or mitigate rodent infestations, and if this was taking place at this location.
No, as far as I know, there's nothing like that going on. The wind turbines, though, at our site are distributed among property of 17 different landowners, and so what's happening in any one parcel of land is going to be very different and is likely to change from one to the next. So it's really a highly variable and heterogeneous wind resource area.
All right, thanks. A couple questions that want to save till the end that I think are more kind of general. Let's see. This one is asking, did the displacement study assume turbine placement was random, and how would a specific type of turbine site be a factor in this study?
Was this do you think this refers to the winter study? I guess, well, first we know that wind turbine placement is not random. So the wind turbines are specifically microsited within a given area to maximize the capture of wind potential. And at our site, the turbines seem to be situated on these micro ridges. So they're rises that are barely perceptible unless you're walking up or toward or away from a wind turbine, and then you realize you're on a slope. That's part of the reason why we chose a plot-based design, is to try to get away from walking a gradient, a line transect from a turbine away from that turbine. And if you were on that linear transect, you would be going down an elevational gradient perhaps, and then that could lead to changes in vegetation, and that would act as a confounding variable in your result. So our survey plots in the winter study were generated at random within habitat that was available to us. And then for the breeding bird survey, our plots were strategically placed in areas that had vegetation and were thought to contain breeding birds. And that was really based on a desire to encounter as many nests as we could, and that should there be an effect of wind turbines, whether it's positive or negative, we'd have the greatest ability to detect that effect.
Okay, thanks. All right, in the interest of time, I think let's move on to the next presentation, and I've got questions that we didn't get to here, and we can come back to them at the end if we've got time afterwards. So thanks so much, Amanda, for taking time to present on these studies. It was very interesting. And Chuck, are you still with us on the phone?
I am.
Great. So let me pull up your PowerPoint here, and then you can take it away. All right, it's coming up. There we go.
Oh, I've got kind of a slow connection. I'm just watching a wheel spin.
Oh, is it still not showing up?
Not for me yet.
All right, let me try one more time. I know this happened the other day, so.
We have a very slow connection, so I'm guessing it's on my end. I'll just go ahead and start a little bit, and it looks like it's catching up. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to present some information here. The next two presentations, mine and there it is for me, and Tanner's, are kind of a joint project. They were done in concert with each other at the same location, and so I'll cover a little bit about the actual study sites, and so Tanner won't have to repeat some of those things, although he will highlight a few areas. It was a collaborative project between the Fish and Wildlife Service, Ducks Unlimited, and one of our wetland management districts down in South Central and North Dakota and North Central South Dakota. A contributor was also NextEra Energy. So there's a lot of wind potential in the Prairie Pothole region, and it's also a very important area continentally for breeding waterfowl. In the PPJV, or excuse me, in the Prairie Pothole region, there's been a pretty rapid growth in the development of wind energy, and in the past 10 plus years, we've increased over 1,000 times from what wind energy development was previous to 2002. Wind also has a fairly large development footprint. That's sort of a concern for us up in the prairies. It has the potential to encompass a large landscape. If we look at what the projected gigawatt output for the North Dakota or for the Prairie Pothole region states is a fairly large footprint. If you were to place all of that wind energy development in one location, it'd be about a 15,000 square mile footprint that's illustrated in the central portion of North Dakota. So it's a fairly substantial land area, has the potential to be impacted. If we look at a map of the wind energy potential, well, I'll back up a step. Most folks are pretty well versed in what the potential effects are. We also, well, the project that I'm going to present is more along the lines of the indirect impacts of wind energy development and what those might be to breeding pairs, and Tanner's going to talk more from a direct impact, so it's a mortality issue. So if we look at some of the graphics that are here on the slide, we see that the wind energy potential in North and South Dakota is fairly high, and it's not evenly distributed, as you might suspect. There's a ridge line, a terminal moraine of the Wisconsinian glaciation that's referred to as the Missouri Coteau. That is a ridge, basically, that at the end of the glacial movement that runs from north to south and then to the northwest, and then a slope area that goes off towards the west to the Missouri River. That wind resource overlaps fairly well with wetland resources. If we look at in the left side of the slide, you can see that line, that Missouri Coteau, and the large wetland resources that are there. That is where our remaining grasslands tend to be as well in the Dakotas and up into northeast Montana. And if we look at some work that's been done to model breeding pair relationships with wetlands and the spatial distribution and density of those pairs, we see that that's also a very important area for breeding waterfowl as well. So there's a lot of overlap in priority areas, both from a conservation perspective and from a wind energy development perspective. As a result, we went ahead and designed a project that was designed to look at the potential impacts of wind energy development on breeding duck pair densities. It was a 3-year study. We did field work in the springs and early summers of 2008, 9, and 10. We used a paired site approach where we had a site where wind energy was developed and then a control site as well. The surveys themselves were wetland-based surveys where we went out and actually counted breeding duck pairs on the ground, and we developed some basin-level predictors models to estimate breeding pair density and response for individual wetland classes and for 5 duck species. Our study sites, as you can see, they straddle the North Dakota-South Dakota border. We identified 2 existing wind tower sites, one just east of Calm, North Dakota, and another just northeast of Long Lake, South Dakota. We chose nearby control sites that had similar upland vegetation components and wetland type and class and acreage distributions as well. And so we had a control site for the Tatanka Wind Farm and an additional control site for the Calm Edgeley Wind Farm. If we look at it graphically a little bit, we have a lot of data to help us understand both the form of the land in those locations as well as the wetland community that occurs at those locations. I should back up and say for the study sites, a challenge was identifying what is the actual site that we would do the surveys and consider either a control or a treatment site, and we buffered the perimeter of the wind individual turbines for a given farm out 1/2 mile and used the farm as a site as opposed to measuring any distances that might be from wetlands to individual towers. So we have a good detailed wetland information derived from National Wetlands Inventory that we can then look at the sites and choose appropriate control sites. And we also have relatively current land cover information, so we could match up locations. For example, the Tatanka site is heavily dominated by grassland, and so the control site was also a grassland-dominated location. The Calm Edgeley is a farming, cultivated land site, and we chose a control site. We identified a number of potential sites and then chose the most comparable location or site characteristics for the control. So the Calm Edgeley site, just an aerial view, consisted of 41 turbines, highly agricultural dominated landscape. The Tatanka site on the flip side is a larger site. It was 120 turbines total, and almost exclusively grassland, sort of a ranching landscape. So we have a couple of different sites relatively close to each other, a couple of different wind sites. Both of them are up along the Missouri Coteau. The actual surveys, we went out and conducted pair surveys on the ground. The sites were divided into 1 square mile blocks based on public land survey section. We identified a potential 5,000 plus wetland basins that encompassed over almost 3,500 hectares in wetland area. We did 2 survey periods to account for differences in breeding phenology between the duck species. Mallards and northern pintails were the emphasis or the target species for the early May counts, and the blue-winged teal, gadwall, and northern shoveler were the targets for the later count in mid to late May through early June. We also recorded wetland conditions and characteristics, visual ocular estimates of percent full, and then some vegetation classes that basically they're vegetation to open water categories that we identified. On a particular site, all wetlands where permission was obtainable were visited and surveyed. My data slide, basically to show folks that we actually did collect some data. We went out and surveyed a fairly large number of wetland basins each year. It did get progressively wetter over the duration of the survey. 2008 was relatively dry. 2009 we had good snowfall and precipitation, and it was quite a bit wetter, and then even got wetter in 2010. So we counted a lot of basins and we surveyed a lot of wetland area. It accumulated up to over 10,000 wetland visits for our pair surveys. We also saw a lot of pairs when we went out, in addition to just visiting wetlands. The upper graphic illustrates the distribution of the 5 species that were targeted by the surveys, and the indicated breeding pair distribution is the number of pairs observed per year in each of the given years. Overall, we identified and recorded data for almost 16,000 breeding pairs for the 3 years. The analysis that was conducted, we went ahead and developed some models for pair densities between wind and reference sites. We identified a number of candidate variables. A lot of this information is, we used an existing survey that's conducted by the Fish and Wildlife Service up in the prairies. That is an annual ground survey to estimate populations and as they relate to different ownership classes, whether it's owned and managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service or private. Anyway, a long history of protocols for this type of survey and the type of information collected, and so we leaned heavily on that survey to build the candidate variables for the research project here. We developed some zero inflated Poisson models, and we retained most covariates or all covariates for most species. What we found, well, we did, this is a slide I kind of refer to as our statistical significance slide. It illustrates the difference between the estimated pairs on the winds versus the reference sites. And we look at, and this is, we're using about a 0.2 hectare seasonal wetland. This is just one wetland size point estimate that we use for comparisons. We can do so for any type of wetland class, and we did, and the results are similar. What we found is that for of the 30 species site wetland class comparisons or species site comparisons in years, that 26 of those showed a negative result, and for 16 of those, confidence intervals did not overlap 0. We would consider those significant. So for overall of the species year and site comparisons, about half of them were significantly lower densities of pairs estimated on wind sites versus non-wind sites. We transition that to a proportional change in numbers of pairs observed, we get a similar result where you have the same numbers of we saw negative displacement in the majority of the comparisons, and again, for about 15%, or about 50% of those comparisons, that the avoidance was considered significant, and a range from about 40 to 56% reduction in the density of pairs on wind sites, wetlands, estimated pair density on wind sites versus non-wind sites. If you roll it all up into about an average, it's about a 20% avoidance over all species and years. So the conclusions that we drew from the data that we collected and the analysis is that, well, for one thing, you know, one of the questions that got thrown out quite a bit is, do pairs even use the wetlands in wind towers? And basically the answer is that they do, but that we see some reduction in the densities of pairs that will use wetlands in proximity to wind turbines within wind farms. So, you know, it wasn't always statistically significant. In fact, it was indistinguishable for some species, site and year combinations. The tendency was for displacement and a negative effect. And then if we, you know, think about this in the context of that large footprint of potential wind energy development, it could be a substantial number of pairs and a reduction in breeding pair capacity, or the habitat that would be available and usable by breeding ducks. We have to put this in the proper context. We only looked at 2 sites over a 3-year period, and so it'd be good to be able to go back and either extend the length of the duration of the project, if possible, expand to other areas, and hopefully understand these impacts in a little bit broader context of the landscape. One thing that I do want to touch on briefly before I finish up, the Fish and Wildlife Service and our partners have a pretty extensive easement program up in the Prairie Pothole area, the Prairie Pothole portions of the U.S. states. And we do a lot of acquisition. We've identified priority zones based on breeding pairs and some other work that we've done in the past. And so we have this model of and an output that helps us decide where to make informed decisions on our conservation delivery. So if we focus on this area where the question is, should we be doing any work, or should we consider working in some of these landscapes, even if there's wind energy development there, in light of the fact that there's some effect that we observed, at least for breeding waterfowl, this on average 20% avoidance. And so if we look at let me get the pointer here. If we look at the upper left, and we assume there's no impact, the tower locations, the wind farms, are here along the edge of the Missouri Coteau. It's a high duck density area, high priority area. If we look at this and assume there's no impact, we would make the decision that because there's a large number of pairs, it still probably is a good place to do some work. If we incorporate this average avoidance of about 21% avoidance, we constrict some of these, the high priority areas, constrict to a lower land area. We see, at least for these 2 wind tower sites, they still fall within the high priority zones, even with avoidance. If we look at the maximum avoidance that we observed, and that was for gadwalls in 1 year, where we had almost 65% fewer estimated or lower estimated density of gadwall pairs, and applied that universally across the landscape, we still would have, because this is such a good wetland complex and has a potential to attract a large number of pairs, even with a large amount of avoidance, the grass in the Tatanka, the southern wind site, still would potentially be a high priority zone. So that's how we're trying to use it to help us inform our conservation decisions. If they're on the edge, if by virtue of 20% avoidance it drops from the high priority zone to a medium priority zone, we might consider passing over that location for another high priority area. But the biological benefit, while it's reduced, there's still a lot of benefit for breeding pairs in some of these areas where wind energy development is happening. So with that, I'll wrap up my portion of the presentation, and I'll transition over into Tanner's.
All right, well, thank you so much. Two questions before we transition, and it looks like a couple others are coming in.
Okay.
The first question is, when did your study take place relative to the wind farms going into operation? In other words, did ducks have a chance to habituate?
There's a different age in the two wind farms, and there's a couple of things, a couple of tendencies, although it's that we did observe. The wind farm in the agricultural site was about 7 years old when we initiated the work. The wind farm in the Grassland site, the Tatanka site, went online in 2008, so the year that the study was initiated. And so we did see, there was some evidence, although not strong, that the densities on the cropland site were lower than on the grassland site, but we don't know if that's a result of age. It doesn't seem like it would be habituation, because then we maybe would have seen more pairs at that site. But at any rate, it may be related to age. It may be related to the land use. I don't know, but we did see some lower densities, evidence of lower densities on the cropland, wetlands on the cropland site versus the grassland.
All right, thank you. One question is, were the number and types of wetlands equal between wind farms and reference sites?
Well, it was, the bottom line is no. I mean, we did identify 3 or 4 potential control sites for each of the wind farm sites, and did some analysis to look at the numbers of the various types of wetlands and the acres, or the land area, the hectares, whatever, of the individual classes, and it's virtually impossible to get them equal, right? And even but they were very comparable, the control and the treatment site. The other thing that kind of throws a wrench in that as well is permission. It would, if we had uniform permission to go to all the wetlands on each of the sites, then that matching them up like we attempted to do, would have been nice. But we didn't, and so we were able to visit the wetlands that we could visit and observe, and it wasn't the entire population of wetlands on a site. They were very comparable, but certainly not exact.
Great, thank you. And one more question before we move on to Tanner, and then we can come back to some of these others that are just coming in now at the end. And this question is, all impacts assume current agricultural use and no land use change. Is there any thought about modifying agricultural use in conjunction with wind farm development?
I'm not sure I understand the question perfectly. The North Dakota is kind of interesting. The state of North Dakota urges landowners to put wind farms in grassland and not affect the cropping of agricultural lands. So that's kind of a negative. With the recent pressures on conversion for ethanol demand and all these other things going on, not very much of the landscape is safe. A lot of the land that land area that we did the work in is being converted either out of CRP, a perennial cover, back into production, and there's a lot of native grass being broken up. And in fact, I have a few pictures where there's a wind tower in the background, and the rocks in the prairie in the foreground, the rocks have been pulled out because they're going to break it up and plant it to crops. And I jokingly said they're using the revenue from the wind tower to buy a new tractor so they can break up the prairie around the wind tower. But that was kind of tongue-in-cheek. But it's the fact is the land use is changing. There's a lot of pressure to turn prairie into agricultural production, and I don't think placing wind towers out in the grassland thinking that it's going to preclude its use as cropland is something that's going to happen. I don't think it's not going to preclude the landowner from breaking up the grass around that tower. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Well, thank you for tackling that. And if the person who asked the question, if that didn't address it and you want to send a follow-up, please do. A couple other questions that we'll come back to if we've got time. So why don't we move on to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Chuck, for taking time to present today. Tanner, are you on the phone with us still?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. Let me pull up your PowerPoint here. Okay, are you seeing it?
Not yet.
All right. Is it syncing or is it?
Got it now.
Okay, great. All right. Take it away. Thanks.
Okay, so first off, I'd just like to say thanks for inviting me to talk. It's a privilege to get to speak to this kind of community with such a broad background about our research. So as you said before, today I'll share with you the results of this is a 2-year telemetry project regarding the effects of wind energy development on breeding season survival of female mallards and blue-winged teal. So I'll try not to cover too much of what Chuck mentioned, but the grasslands and wetlands of the Prairie Pothole region make it the most productive areas for waterfowl on the continent. But as Chuck mentioned, this area is also suitable for large-scale wind energy development, and you can see that overlap here between the PPR and an area of high wind energy potential on the map right here. And based on what Chuck just talked about, we know that fewer duck pairs, when they're migrating north in the spring, fewer pairs may settle to breed in wind-developed landscapes, but as Chuck mentioned, these areas can still support quite a few breeding pairs. So zooming in at a closer scale, what about the birds that do choose to settle and breed in wind-developed landscapes? How could wind turbines influence locally breeding populations of ducks that would matter to waterfowl managers and their goals of maintaining a high conservation value of wetland and grassland habitat dominated landscapes, kind of like the landscape in the background photo here. So that's the direction we headed with this portion of the research, and that's what I'll talk about today. So let's see. So we know that survival of adult female mallards and other upland nesting ducks during the breeding season is one of the most limiting factors on population growth. And female dabbling ducks suffer greater mortality during the breeding season than any other period of their annual life cycle, just because of dangers inherent to ground nesting life history strategies. Spending up to 20 hours per day on their nest during peak incubation times makes a nesting female pretty vulnerable to predators like the fox shown here. But wind turbines may introduce a new source, a novel source of mortality, and that is through direct collision for these breeding females. Ducks that settle in wind-developed landscapes, they could be susceptible to collision simply because they're just spending more time around wind turbines in the vicinity of the towers. But we thought that they might be particularly susceptible to collision during multi-bird mate flights, like this 3-bird flight in the background photo here. This is a time when their awareness of features like wind turbines may be lower when they're up in the air. It's an acrobatic type display, some of them. So the majority of these kinds of flights occur early in the breeding season when territories are being established, and this occurs shortly after their arrival on the breeding grounds. So for birds that do settle in areas with wind turbines, they might be more susceptible to collision early in the breeding season, as shown here in this hypothetical explanation, where the probability of collision decreases as the female starts to spend more time on her nest, formating a clutch, incubating, and then rearing broods. So because we know that female survival during the breeding season is important for population growth, we used impact reference study design, and we marked pre-nesting and nesting female mallards and blue-winged teal with VHF transmitters in a site with wind turbines, and that's the Tatanka Wind Farm, which I will probably refer to as TWF today, and one adjacent reference site without wind towers that I'll probably refer to as either reference or ref. So we were looking at adult survival of breeding females. And we were particularly interested in quantifying direct mortality due to collisions, and we wanted to determine the overall influence of wind towers on breeding season survival of females. Also, before I move on, predators might be, as Amanda alluded to, kind of in the opposite context, but they might be more efficient at locating duck nests and therefore nesting females in disturbed landscapes. It's a pretty common hypothesis for waterfowl ecologists, but because wind turbines are associated with things like turbine roads, as shown in the picture here, and tower pads and things like that, we also had our eyes peeled for an increase in predator-related mortalities at TWF. So our study site's located here, right on the North Dakota-South Dakota border. This is the Tatanka Wind Farm, again, that Chuck was talking about, operated by Axiota Wind Energy. And we did not mark any birds at the Cullum Edgeley Wind Farm that Chuck was talking about, too. We restricted ourselves to TWF and this reference site. So the solid shaded area in the southeast corner is TWF. Again, there's 120 wind turbines there. The patterned area to the northwest is the reference site, and there's no turbines there, and we selected this site, as Chuck said, based off of landscape similarities, landscape characteristic similarities. We trapped pre-nesting female mallards in decoy traps, as shown on the left side of the screen there. We did this by targeting territorial pairs of mallards, and oftentimes we identified them as territorial by observing three-bird flights like that picture I showed you before. Same picture is in the upper right-hand corner of the screen there. So once we identified a territorial pair that we thought was likely to eventually set up shop in the area and nest in the area, we set our trap with the domestic decoy bird inside. And that domestic hen is the bait. It's supposed to trigger a territorial response from a wild female, and that's how we capture them. We also trapped nesting female mallards and blue-winged teal in walk-in traps and mist nets after we located nests with a nest dragging technique. And you can see an example of a walk-in kind of a funnel trap over the nest there. So we caught some blue-winged teal and some mallards doing that too. And we marked all females with a 9-gram prong and suture style transmitter. An example of one of those is shown there kind of in the lower right portion of your slide. This transmitter had a mortality switch on it, of course, so we could tell when these females were alive or dead. We used truck-mounted null peak systems with location of a signal software to triangulate birds almost daily. And if females were missing from our daily tracking list, we used exclusively search for them using our vehicles and also aerial telemetry inside and outside of the wind farm and the reference site. Upon hearing a mortality signal, we immediately pursued it until we determined the cause of death for each female. We created a set of candidate models that allowed survival to vary by site, so TWF or REF, to account for the presence of wind turbines, and year 2009 and 2010. This is a 2-year project to account for pretty commonly noted annual variation in female survival. We used date, continuous variable, to account for potential within-season time trends in daily survival rate of females, but this time trend is linear and may not have accurately reflected a realistic pattern of breeding season survival of females. So we included this quadratic time trend, date squared, in our analysis, which allowed survival to follow a curvilinear pattern, and this helped us assess our prediction that females might be more susceptible to collision early in the breeding season. We used maximum likelihood estimation in program MARC to evaluate relative support for candidate models and assess survival trends. We used the ragged entry design, as I noted there, just allowed us to directly evaluate covariates, continuous covariates like date and date squared. Very quickly here you can see the number of marked birds by species, site, and year, with exposure days in parentheses below each category there. I should mention here that MAL, M-A-L-L, is the acronym for Mallards. BWTE is the acronym for blue-winged teal. So we ended up analyzing survival data for 147 female mallards and 163 blue-winged teal across sites and years. This is a total of 310 females and just over 13,000 exposure days. Of these 310 females, 128 of them we monitored for the entire breeding season, the entire sampling period, which was about 90 days. 136 were right censored, and we found 46 of them dead. The number of radio-marked females, just to give you a little more idea of the kind of sample we're dealing with. The number of radio-marked females included in the analysis varied throughout each year, but generally declined in late July. So the dark portion of each bar here represents the number of females in the sample on that day at TWF. And the light portion of each bar is the number of females in the sample on that day at REF. So week 1 is mid-April, so that means week 14 is mid-July, late July. So you can see in general we did a pretty good job of monitoring females throughout the breeding season, especially for mallards. But I should point out that we did not begin monitoring blue-winged teal until about mid-May, that 4th week. That's typically when they begin nesting up here in the Dakotas, and we nest tracked all of our blue-winged teal. So here's the mortalities that we observed by species and site and year and mortality factor. 77% of our deaths across both species were caused by predators. We did have 2 mallard collision mortalities during this 2-year study at TWF, one of which, however, we couldn't confidently identify the source of the collision. There was a wind turbine right there. There was a barbed wire fence. There was a power line. The power line was not associated with the wind turbine. That power line was there for years. The other one, however, the female in 2010, she was undoubtedly ran into a wind turbine. The other mortality factor category there includes deaths that were caused by rare events for our sample, like we had a nesting female that was run over by a hay swather when they were cutting hay. We had, 4 of those deaths in the other category were unknowns. We submitted them for further inspection. 3 of those 4 came back unknown. 1 of them may have drowned. So very quickly here, not to bore you, but I just want to pick out a couple important trends. This is the model results for our mallard survival models. First, we observed a strong support that female mallard daily survival rate varied within the season. As you can see, we have date squared, that quadratic variable, in the top 3 models. Second, we observed some support that survival varied by year, which is pretty common, not a huge surprise there. And third, there's some evidence that survival may have varied by site. There in the top model, we have some support for site. So let's take a look at the best model here. This is a lot to look at too, but bear with me. Here we have the relationship between within season time trends as a quadratic and daily survival rate of female mallards. So on the primary y-axis of each chart here, all 4 of them, we have the daily survival rate. On the x-axis, we have the week after initiation of marking. On the secondary y-axis, I included the proportion of females, proportion of radio-marked females that were known to be incubating, and I represented those with the gray bars. So according to the best approximating model for female mallard survival, it differed between sites and years, and in each site and year, female mallard survival was lowest in the middle of the breeding season when the highest proportion of females that we knew about were known to be incubating. So the fact that we observed few collisions and survival is lowest in the middle of the season when all predators are out and females are vulnerable to predation. This provides pretty strong support that collision mortality is probably not at a level that should be of huge concern for breeding females. So let's jump to blue-winged teal here. Looking at the blue-winged teal results, daily survival rate was best described by a constant model. That's not all that interesting. But according to a constant model, breeding season survival of blue-winged teal here was 0.69, which is right in the ballpark of what we see, or what we've seen in the literature before. Unlike mallards, we did not observe much support for within-season variation in daily survival rate. That date squared is pretty far down in the list there. But importantly, there was some support for relationship between survival and site, so we see that at the second model. So just out of curiosity, let's take a look at the point estimates for our top mallard model, which, if you remember, included the effect of wind turbines, and this second blue-winged teal model, just to see what it comes out as. So according to our top mallard model, 14-week survival of breeding female mallards was 0.83 and 0.84 at rest in 2009 and 2010 respectively. And then it was a little higher at TWF in 2009, but then pretty low at TWF in 2010. For blue-winged teal, some evidence to suggest that survival may have been lower at the wind farm site, TWF, than at rest. But again, that was not our top model. So just real quick, so a short wrap-up of our adult survival portion of the research here. Again, most of the mortalities for mallards were due to predators, and blue-winged teal, all of our blue-winged teal mortalities were due to predators. We confirmed only 1 mallard mortality due to collision with a wind turbine. So at this scale, mortality of breeding females as a result of direct collision is probably not of great concern. So we only have very modest evidence to suggest that there was a difference in survival between the two sites, but taken together with the lack of collision mortality that we observed, this may reflect a potential indirect effect of wind development activity on female survival. And I think that could bring up a pretty interesting question, and Amanda alluded to these kinds of relationships before. And that is, what are the effects of wind energy development on duck predator communities? Do wind turbines change local predator community composition or abundance or anything like that? And I think this could be an important question down the road when we're trying to figure out the compatibility issues between wind energy development and grassland and wetland conservation goals in the Prairie Pothole region. So with that, I need to say thanks to quite a few folks. You can read through the list there, but in general, Prairie Pothole Joint Venture supported this research. Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center with USGS there in Jamestown, North Dakota, provided a lot of expertise and equipment. NextEra Energy, North Dakota Game and Fish, Chuck and the folks at Happett, Ducks Unlimited, of course, and the University of North Dakota. So thank you very much. With that, I'll do my best to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tanner. A couple questions, and hopefully we'll have time to go back to some of the earlier ones as well. The first question is about the control site and what the basis was for establishing a control site that was just outside the half-mile buffer of the wind farm.
Well, Chuck might be, if he's still on the line, he might be able to help out with this, but for a telemetry project like ours, breeding females are spending, or their, an average home range size is less than 4 square miles. So we didn't think that if we were marking females inside the wind turbine site, TWF, they wouldn't be overlapping too much with the reference site. So when you are, I don't know if any of you have done a telemetry project, but when you're keeping track of 310 breeding females, you've got a crew of 6 or 8 people and 3 telemetry trucks. The closer your sites are together, the better. And these sites are pretty similar anyway, so it worked out for the telemetry project. But maybe Chuck wants to talk about the pair project too. I don't know.
You're right, Tanner. The logic behind it is very much entrenched in duck breeding biology and the distance that some of these females in their home ranges are, as far as especially for the pair surveys, to actually survey wetlands that are likely within the distance of at least the edge of the closest turbines that are potentially that they're close enough within the context of the home range, and if there's an impact, it would be measurable. And so it has a lot to do with the home range size of the species that we're working with.
Great, thank you. 2 similar questions that came in about differentiating between predator-caused mortality and predator scavenged from turbine collision, and how did you differentiate those 2?
Yeah, so we used a few characteristics of the carcass. One was obviously if it was chewed up or not. The collision that we observed was very obviously a collision, so that's pretty easy to determine. But I imagine the question is arising from thinking about a time lag where you have a potential scenario where a marked breeding female runs into a wind turbine, or the turbine collides with the duck, and we fail to get to that mortality before a fox does or a skunk. And so 3 days later, or 6 or 7 days later, we find the carcass, and it actually ran into a wind turbine, fell below the wind turbine, and was picked up by a skunk, or something like that. We did the best we could. Most of our mortalities that we observed, we got to the carcass within 2 days of its previous live encounter. And there's a project that was completed at Buffalo Ridge Wind Farm in Minnesota, so I'm thinking that they'll probably have very similar predator communities. I think the average time it took a predator to find a bird that was below a wind turbine, a dead bird below a wind turbine, was about 7 days. So I feel pretty comfortable and pretty confident in saying that we got to these dead females as quickly as possible and quickly enough to determine if it was actually a collision or a scavenge.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This question is asking about the tagging of the, I think it's BWTE, that's a blue-winged teal, is that correct?
Yep, blue-winged teal.
Yep. And you guys tagged them when they were already on the nest, and if that impacted the ability to look at the hypothesized potential peak in death by collision during mating flights, or was that captured in the second year?
Yep, I understand. I think I understand the question. So that's something that we were concerned about when we initially started marking blue-winged teal on the nest. We thought, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to really answer the same kind of question, and we talk about that in this paper. That's something that is a concern. But we do know that, I mean, you learn a lot about ducks when you have transmitters on them, about individuals. We do know that quite a few birds that we marked, quite a few blue-winged teal that we marked on the nest failed at nesting, and as is pretty typical for the Prairie Pothole region. They failed at nesting, and then we were able to detect that these birds had initiated a new nest later on, and sometimes birds initiated a third nest. Even blue-winged teal were initiating a third nest, and so we felt like because we were able to monitor these birds from the point where we put the transmitters on them, they were nesting, they failed at nesting there, so that requires that they re-enter the cycle and they go through the breeding territoriality issues, and maybe are flying around with lone males, and their potential for collision then increases again before they initiate that second nest. So I can't remember exactly how many birds we had that re-nested, but it was enough to make us feel comfortable about saying that collision mortality is probably not much of an issue even for pre-nesting blue-winged teal.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is a general question. Someone asked about the PowerPoints, and we will have the recording of this webinar as well as the PDFs of the PowerPoints available on the website. And am I correct that there are publications associated with all of these projects?
Yeah,
is that...
I think so.
Okay, and so what we can do also is put links to where you can get those publications if they're of interest, so that all the information is in one place for everyone. All right, well, we've got 5 more minutes, so why don't we go back to some of these questions. Amanda, are you still with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Going some more specific questions related to, I think probably the second study, is if there are any birds in the study that fly or migrate through the rotor swept area of turbines.
So yes, so when the birds are migrating, it's likely they're going to be at an altitude that certainly could put them at risk of passing through that rotor swept zone. For those, we don't have any fatality data from our site in the wintertime to know, for example, if any of the Sprague's pipits are colliding or that sort of thing. In the summer months, though, we do have fatality data, and Dickcissels are the most abundant breeding bird at the site, and they make up less than 1% of all the bird carcasses that we found. So I'd have to go back and look up the exact number, but my guess is we found 2 or 3 Dickcissels over 5 years of monitoring fatality during the breeding season.
Okay, thank you. And another question is asking about what are the thoughts on why the birds would leave? Noise, vehicle traffic, habitat loss, etc.
Probably any combination of the above. So it could be noise, it could be vibrations, it could be flicker, shadow from the blades in the sun and that interaction. It's just we don't have any data. So right now those are all hypotheses and speculation. And as far as I know, there hasn't been a study to actually look at the response of individual birds to those sorts of disturbances at wind farms.
Great, thanks. And the last question is more broad, looking at asking if anyone is studying the effects of wind turbines on aerial courtship species, rather than those that are low elevation oriented species.
So I think Tanner and Chuck can probably speak on this as well, but just for example, at our study site, we have there's a large breeding population of scissor-tailed flycatchers, and we've got a paper that looks at nest success in scissor-tails near wind turbines, and they also seem to have higher nest survivorship close to wind turbines than far away, and they have this aerial courtship display, and in all the years that we've done fatality monitoring, we've not found a single scissor-tailed flycatcher carcass in those searches. And so at least for that particular species, they seem to be highly maneuverable, but I don't know if their courtship flight takes them quite up into the rotor swept zone or not, but that would certainly be something to look at.
Great, thank you. All right, let's see what other questions we haven't answered. This question for Chuck, and I guess for you as well, Tanner, asking if there is any data regarding breeding pairs pre- and post-construction, if any studies have been done that look at this.
This is Chuck. There are none that I'm aware of, not on breeding waterfowl.
Okay, thank you. Question asking if there's any even anecdotal evidence of collision mortality of male ducks at the site.
Yeah, we observed. I would have to look back at the numbers. That's something that we didn't publish, but there were a few male ducks. I'll just leave it at a few. I think that would be safe. There were a few male ducks, and if I recall, they were mostly mallards that appeared to have run into wind turbines or had collided with wind turbines. But again, I'd just like to say for whoever asked that question that we marked breeding females because these are the population drivers. Yeah, it matters if a male runs into a wind turbine, but not nearly as much as if a female does. They're the producers. So.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. This question is kind of asking if, Chuck, if you're willing to speculate on the mechanism that might be driving the observed decrease in breeding pair density that you observed, if you're willing to.
Yeah, I unfortunately the answer is we don't really know. You know, all we do know is that it kind of goes back to some of the earlier discussion, and that's the actual mechanism where the study really wasn't designed to identify that. So whether it's issues related to disturbance due to, you know, the fleet of vehicles and manpower maintaining the towers, or rotor flicker, or any of those sorts of things, it's really we really don't have the data to identify the mechanism.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you. Let's see if there are any other quick questions. I think we got most of them. If anyone didn't have their question addressed, we'll try to follow up afterwards if possible. And 4:30, so I think it's time to wrap up. And I just wanted to thank all of our presenters for taking the time today to share your work with us. We had, I think, record attendance, so about 130 folks on the webinar. So glad to see so many people interested, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today. So have a great afternoon, all.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.